Complex just dropped a list of its 10 weakest years in hip-hop. For those who may not be familiar, Complex is fashion designer Marc Ecko's media company. So while I do have some influence and reach, they're not quite the same as Billboard or Apple Music or any of those other outlets when it comes to talking about music and hip-hop in particular. But regardless of who these lists come from, I like taking them, I like giving my opinion, I like breaking them down, and that's exactly what we're going to do in this video. Complex also did a separate list for the 20 best years in hip-hop. I may or may not touch that at a future date. I just think the 10 worst years is a little more fun and it gives me more material to work with. I've had a few days to digest this, and I'm definitely not doing a blind react like when Billboard dropped their top 100. So that's where we stand. Let's get it. Let's dive right in. We start off with the year 2001, which Complex considers the 10th worst year in hip-hop history. So for each of these years, Complex gave their opinion as to why it sucked and why there may have been silver linings in that year. For 2001, they mentioned there were too many rappers making commercial hits for the radio. That's an accurate take. A silver lining was the Jay-Z-Nas feud, another accurate take. And I think we can confidently say that The Blueprint by Jay-Z was the most influential hip-hop record to come out in 2001. But there was also Nas's Stillmatic, Missy Elliott's Missy, So Addictive, Fabulous's Ghetto Fabulous, Ludacris's Word of Mouth, and also Beanie Siegel's The Reason. New York and the East Coast definitely held the crown in 2001, though the South had some influential records coming out as well, such as Project Pat's Mr. Don't Play, UGK's Dirty Money, and the Dungeon Family's Even in Darkness. Now, 2001 was also a time where underground hip-hop was really burgeoning, and that includes one of my favorite hip-hop albums of all time, The Cold Vein by Cannibal Ox. Underground legend A$AP Rock dropped one of his best records in Labor Days, Master Ace dropped the awesome Disposable Arts, Cormega released The Realness, and J-Live gave us The Best Part. Towards the end of the year, hip-hop fans just kind of stood there and watched the barbs being exchanged between Jay-Z and Nas, and that also ended up including other artists like Prodigy of Mobb Deep. And a lot of this got going with the release of Jay-Z's The Blueprint, which infamously came out on September 11th, 2001. Earlier in the summer, there was a classic Philly-New York war between Jadakiss and Beanie Siegel, which was sort of a warm-up fight for the main title card that came later in the year. Is 2001 one of hip-hop's 10 worst years? Doubtful. It was a pretty active year, and while there was a lot of mainstream garbage, there was a lot of high-profile things happening both in the underground and with the feuds, which really gave us hip-hop fans some real entertainment. I feel like we could have done a lot worse in a year like 2001, so I don't really agree with this placement. The number 9 worst year on Complex's list is 2014, and I think I agree with this one a little bit more. Complex cites that 2014 had a lack of music from the stars of the day, while the next generation's talent was still underdeveloped. And to be honest, the stars of 2014 were pretty underwhelming. They mention Iggy Azalea, Young Thug, YG, Bobby Shmurda, and a few others, and their silver lining, by the way, is Young Thug's breakout. So while I can appreciate his style, I'm just not a huge fan of his stuff. What they failed to mention is one of the best hip-hop records of the 21st century given to us by Freddie Gibbs and Madlib, and that was Pinata. Run the Jewels gave us a solid second effort. Death Grips gave us a short but dynamic album. Artists like Clipping, Open Mike Eagle, and Prime, which was the collaboration between Royce the 5'9" and DJ Premier, all released solid projects. But beyond that, I kind of agree. I think 2014 really just wasn't the strongest year. Hip-hop's next generation was kind of really developing during that time, and while artists like J. Cole, Kendrick Lamar, and Danny Brown had already broken out, this was a time where the best Gen Z rappers had yet to emerge. J. Cole, in fact, did drop his most celebrated project, 2014 Forest Hills Drive. But yeah, more or less, I agree. 2014, it wasn't the best year for hip-hop, but let's not forget about that mouth-watering Freddie Gibbs and Madlib project. That remains a modern masterpiece to this day. So I think Complex is mostly right about the number 8 worst year, which is 2009. If I were doing a top 10 worst years for hip-hop list, I would probably put 2009 in my top 5. So according to Complex, hip-hop didn't really have much of an identity that year, and the silver lining for 2009 was more interesting niche music. I look at the top hip-hop albums from 2009, and I'm not super impressed, though there are some solid projects in there. Of course, every year is going to have something. Most Def's The Ecstatic was actually pretty good, and Raekwon's Only Built for Cuban Links Part 2 is actually probably my top hip-hop record from that year. Kid Cudi probably released what was the biggest record of the year in Man on the Moon, End of the Day, and MF Doom even dropped the underrated Born Like This. To Complex's point, underground niche scenes such as Odd Future started to emerge in 2009. Fashawn, Idea and Abilities, and Brother Ali helped establish and sustain some stronger local scenes, and even guys like Currency and Gucci Mane dropped some fun projects. But yeah, overall, hip-hop was in this weird transitionary state in 2009. Most of the greats from the 90s were quiet by this time, and the Kendricks and the Coles hadn't quite emerged yet outside of the local scenes that they were a part of. I think number 8's too generous, and while 2009 was a year where there were a lot of future greats gaining gaining steam. The output from that year, overall, it's pretty rough. Shout out to Raekwon and the Wu-Tang Clan for putting one of the few good hip-hop sequels together in Only Built for Cuban Links Part 2. Number 7 on Complex's list of worst hip-hop years is 2012. I don't know, man. There were some really solid albums that dropped that year. So here's where it starts to get a little hairy for me. Complex thinks that 2012 sucked because conservative rap releases dominated while newer sounds were marginalized. What? Did they not hear Good Kid Mad City by Kendrick Lamar? Did they miss The Money Store by Death Grips? What about Killer Mike's rap music? What about underground releases that are now considered classics, including Rock Marciano's Reloaded, Billy Wood's History Will Absolve Me, Lil Ugly Man's Mr. Thug Isolation, and Kaz Grief Pedigree? So their silver lining includes the breakout of the drill scene, which was led by Chief Keef and his debut Finally Rich. So I guess you could consider that the silver lining for 2012 over the release of classics like Good Kid Mad City and Reloaded. I didn't think Big Crit's Forever and a Day was conservative, nor was OC and Apollo Brown's Trophies, LPs, Cancer for Cure. You had Brooklyn legend Sean Price dropping the awesome Mike Tyson. Even Nas gave us a mid-career classic with Life is Good. The rise of Pro Era, which looked like it was going to help define the next wave of East Coast hip-hop, was spearheaded by Joey Badass's excellent mixtape 1999. 2012 was, unfortunately, the year that we lost Capital Steez of Pro Era, and it looked like Joey Badass and the whole crew were really going to take over that next wave of East Coast hip-hop, along with fellow New York groups like the ASAP Mob. I guess there was a lot of mainstream trash out there in 2012, but what really irks me is that Complex is minimalizing the release of Good Kid Mad City. So Complex said, and I quote, "Sometimes one great album can lift up a so-so year, but conversely, in a so-so year, even a solid album can be perceived as an all-time great. Case in point, Kendrick Lamar's Good Kid Mad City, an album that benefited from being released during a mediocre year in rap music." Do they really think that Kendrick's second album would have paled in comparison if it were released during the same year as modern-day classics such as Danny Brown's Triple X, Kanye West's My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy, or Tyler, the Creator's Flower Boy? No, there's a reason why Good Kid Mad City is celebrated as much as it is today, and it's not because it didn't have any competition in 2012. Come on. Sorry, I think it's a trash take. I think this is an absolute garbage take, and I think they must be Drake stans over there at Complex. 2012 was actually a pretty solid year for hip-hop, and I thought Complex dropped the ball with this one. So 2019 is listed by Complex as the 6th worst year in hip-hop history. This might make a little more sense than 2012. While there were some underground classics, there were some really tragic deaths that sort of marred the year as a whole. Nipsey Hussle's death was one of the biggest ones in recent history, and while Juice WRLD was more of a pop artist and wasn't really hip-hop at the core, his death really still sent shockwaves through the community. And they list the silver lining as Cardi B being the first female artist to win Best Rap Artist, which is actually pretty cool, even if I'm not feeling Cardi B or Invasion of Privacy, which actually came out in 2018. They focus on, surprise, surprise, the more mainstream stuff, such as Lil Nas X's Old Town Road, and that wildly bad Chance the Rapper project. But they failed to mention great releases by artists like JPEG Mafia, Little Sims, Danny Brown, Quelle Chris, and even Griselda, who was really starting to emerge in 2019. There's a passing reference to Tyler, the Creator's Igor, which wasn't truly a hip-hop album, but it was a really good record that was done by someone who had made their entire career off of hip-hop prior to that album. And once again, they ignore Freddie Gibbs and Madlib, who come back 5 years later with the sequel to Pinata, Bandana, which is almost as good. Also ignored, not surprisingly, is Billy Woods and Kenny Siegel's Hiding Places, which is one of the best hip-hop records of the 21st century, in my opinion, though it is pretty underground. So yeah, there were some great records in 2019, but there were also some tragic deaths and big-time disappointments as well. I guess I get 2019 being where it is, though I probably wouldn't put it in my top 10 worst years for hip-hop. Halfway through, and time for another shameless call to action. If you like what you're seeing, let me know in the comments. Love to discuss. I try to respond to all comments that come through. And I am still a smaller creator, though I've been growing lately, and I couldn't do it without you guys. Thank you all, and I would love it if you subscribe to the channel. Okay, so number 5, I have a problem with. There's no way you can consider 1999 to be the 5th worst year in hip-hop history. The reasoning from Complex includes too much bleak end-of-the-world rap, but they do mention the release of MF Doom's debut in the Silver Linings section. That's a nice little nod to the underground. By 1999, the shiny suit era had already ruined a good thing. But in response to this, there was a really robust underground scene that did develop, ranging from slightly slightly more well-known records such as Mos Def's Black on Both Sides, to more hidden gems like Nia by Black Alicious and 8Ball and MJG's In Our Lifetime. One thing Complex does mention is the more underwhelming releases from more mainstream artists, such as Jay-Z giving us kind of a mediocre effort on Volume 3, The Life and Times of S. Carter, and Nas gave us 2 albums that were ultimately disappointments, though I think I Am and Nostradamus both have their moments. And while I think Nostradamus is the weaker of those 2 albums and probably one of Nas's weakest projects, I don't think it's as bad as a lot of people make it out to be. But again, in response to that shiny suit era, the East Coast new underground faction had woken up and was in full swing, with excellent efforts like The Roots' Things Fall Apart, Operation Doomsday by MF Doom, Pharoah Monch's Internal Affairs, as well as A Prince Among Thieves by Prince Paul, which actually did get a shout out within the article. We also had 2 weird but fun projects from Bronx legend Kool Keith, and then of course there was that turn of this century emergence of Dr. Dre's Aftermath Records with the release of Eminem's The Slim Shady LP and Dr. Dre's 2001, both in 1999. And even 3 6 Mafia, who had been grinding on the Memphis streets for years, released a couple of great albums under their umbrella, including albums from Project Pat, Koopsta, and the side project Tear the Club Up Thugs. So I don't think I would put 1999 in my top 10, but I certainly would not put it in my bottom 10, though I am impressed that they gave Prince Paul and MF Doom a shout out. So far I've noticed that Complex lets their opinions pretty much be determined 75% by the mainstream, 25% by the underground. I just don't think that's right. I don't think they're looking deep enough, and their placement of 1999 is a prime example. If they acknowledged how good the underground was, this would not be in the bottom 10. Number 4 is a year I actually agree with, and that's 2007. Goofy ringtown rap was everywhere was a pretty accurate statement, and the silver lining that year was Kanye West's graduation. At the same time, Soulja Boy was probably the biggest thing in hip-hop in 2007, and anytime someone like Soulja Boy is the defining moment of a year, you know that's not a great year. That Kanye record was everywhere, I think, in the summer of 2007, and honestly it annoyed me then, and it annoys me now. And I'm not the hugest Kanye fan, but his first 2 albums are great, and I felt like it was a downgrade from his earlier work. But once again, the underground is where you have to look. Having said that, even underground hip-hop in 2007 wasn't as robust as it had been in previous years or would be in future years to come. There were quality efforts from Blue in Exile, LP, Y Society, Cunning Linguist, Brother Ali, Aesop Rock, Dialect, and also UGK had a solid record, though it would be the duo's last with Pimp C, who passed away at the end of the year, and his death was a big part of why 2007 probably does get a bad reputation, rightfully so, as he was a legend. Lupe Fiasco had a solid second record in 2007, and there were more under-the-radar releases from Percy P, Killah Priest, Sean Price, and others. But 2007 at number 4, that makes perfect sense for me. The underground scene was slowing down, and in retrospect, the year was kind of defined by a way overrated Kanye West album and Soulja Boy. I just knew it. I knew they were going to throw a year from hip-hop's golden age somewhere near the top just to piss the old heads off. Now, mind you, I was a toddler during hip-hop's golden age in the early 90s, but I've always gravitated towards hip-hop sound between 1987 and 1996. So to name 1990 as the number 3 worst hip-hop year of all time is borderline blasphemous, and it either shows a lack of education or the need to be controversial. Complex does acknowledge debuts from A Tribe Called Quest, Brand Nubian, and Ice Cube, but mentions that 1990 came up short due to, you guessed it, what was happening in the mainstream. The mainstream was dominated by Vanilla Ice and MC Hammer, and Complex essentially lets this define 1990 as a bad hip-hop year. I will say that East Coast hip-hop started to kind of have its integrity compromised a little bit after 1990 as the sound really shifted to the West Coast. But how can you call a year with Ice Cube's America's Most Wanted, Public Enemy's Fear of a Black Planet, A Tribe Called Quest, People's Instinctive Travels and the Paths of Rhythm, Above the Laws, Living Like Hustlers, Cool G Rap and DJ Polo's Wanted Dead or Alive, and Paris's The Devil Made Me Do It, the 3rd worst year in hip-hop history? Eric B. and Rakim's Let the Rhythm Hit Him, the Ghetto Boys self-titled record, Master Ace's Take a Look Around, Brand Nubian's One for All, Lord Finesse's Funky Technician, Poor Righteous Teacher's Holy Intellect, Intelligent Hoodlum's debut, X-Clan's debut, Compton's Most Wanted's debut, Digital Underground's debut. I could literally go on for 10 more minutes listing great hip-hop albums from 1990. Forget Vanilla Ice, forget Marky Mark and the fucking Funky Bunch, or whoever was appropriating hip-hop culture at that time. 1990 was too good of a year to rank as the 3rd worst in hip-hop history. I'd actually argue it was a top 10 or top 15 year, and I don't know why the hell Complex doesn't see it that way. It was filled with a lot of groundbreaking hip-hop and a lot of controversial political stuff, and maybe, just maybe, maybe. That's why Complex ranked it so low. However, Complex even cites the fact that DJ Jazzy Jeff and the Fresh Prince won a Grammy for Best Rap Performance. Now, do we need any further evidence that 1990 was not a bad year for hip-hop? I think not. The second worst year for hip-hop, according to Complex, was 2023, which I think is also quite out of pocket. Okay, so Complex thought 2023 sucked because the spotlight was on for the 50th anniversary of hip-hop, and they say that the music came up short that year. How about forget about the music for a second, the fact that it was so triumphantly celebrated that hip-hop turned 50. For me, that almost automatically gives a pass as not being one of the 10 worst years for hip-hop. Here in New York City, the concerts, the festivals, the activities they had, it was a freaking blast. So that's a huge L on that point. So yes, it was special that hip-hop celebrated its 50th anniversary in 2023, but Complex once again is demonstrating that they did not actually listen to the best music from 2023 when it came to hip-hop. Again, mainstream hip-hop was pretty weak, and it pretty much always will be no matter the year. Complex failed to see the greatness of records like Scaring the Hoes between JPEG Mafia and Danny Brown, which is probably the most dynamic and jaw-dropping hip-hop album of the decade. They clearly didn't give a shit about Arm & Hammer and the release of We Buy Diabetic Test Strips, along with the absolutely incredible collaboration between, once again, Billy Woods and Kenny Siegel, Maps, which I think is one of the best albums of the decade. You had Danny Brown dropping a great solo album with Quaranta. McKinley Dixon came through and gave us an excellent, lush, jazzy album in Beloved Paradise Jazz. And freaking Nas even gave us Magic 3, which was a very solid record that dropped on his 50th birthday. And since Complex loves the mainstream so much, they gave just this barely passing mention to Travis Scott's Utopia, which I thought was actually pretty good. They were more concerned about how no rapper had a #1 album in the first half of the year. Again, focus more on charts, sales, and popularity, not on the other side of hip-hop, which is underground, alternative, trailblazing artistry. Even in the year where hip-hop triumphantly celebrated its golden anniversary, Complex could only focus on ridiculous things like chart positioning, Lil Durk, and Doja Cat. Man, I'm getting tired. Luckily, we're at the end of the list because I'm really losing patience at this point. So Complex's #1 worst year for hip-hop is 2020, which it's not as bad as 1999 or 2023, but I don't know about the #1 worst year of all time. 2020 was the year where we got a lot of music from a lot of artists. Everybody was trapped inside from the pandemic, and that's exactly what Complex cited as not being good about 2020. We couldn't go to shows, we couldn't enjoy all this new artistic output, which is a good point. They go on to say the silver lining was the way that artists and hip-hop music showed its versatility, which included the rise of platforms like Versus, which is another accurate observation in my book. From a musical standpoint, a lot of the emphasis, especially in the middle of the year, was on Pop Smoke, who passed away in February of that year. A couple of his songs, including Dior, became kind of the de facto anthems of the George Floyd protests in May and June 2020. However, one of the artists that did a lot of great things in 2020 that didn't even get an acknowledgement on here is The Alchemist. He dropped fantastic records with both Freddie Gibbs and Boldy James, and guest produced his way through much of the underground and alternative hip-hop scenes. And I think a lot of Alchemist's work in the year 2020 was a major contribution on why he's now one of the GOATs when it comes to producers. There were also great projects from Ka, Run the Jewels, Navy Blue, West Side Gun, Clipping, Arm & Hammer, Stove God Cooks, Pink Sifu, and even though I'm not a big fan of his, we should acknowledge the importance and the reach of Playboi Carti's Whole Lotta Red. There were a lot of big hip-hop deaths in 2020, with the two biggest ones being Pop Smoke and MF Doom. Even though we got a lot of great projects from artists who were trapped at home or in the studio, as Complex mentioned, we didn't get a great chance to enjoy all of this new music and artistic output live until the following year. Complex did mention the emergence of TikTok, which kind of led to a lack of separation between music and personal lives of these artists. And they go on to kind of say for this reason that hip-hop has not really ever recovered from the pandemic. And while I agree that artistry may have been sort of diluted in that way, I think being cooped up gave these artists kind of a new energy, a new recharged energy that helped them with some of their best creative output. In the years since the pandemic ended, we've been blessed with some fantastic hip-hop music. So while I'm not quite an old head, but I'm also not Gen Z, I sort of straddle the line between the two. And there's great music coming out from both new and old artists. I think hip-hop's in a fantastic state here as we head into the second half of the 2020s. I just think the overall output is actually very surprising what we've seen in the first half of this decade. And that comes back to the overall vibe of this list, which is of course pretty negative. It is a worst of list, so you kind of have to roll with the punches in that sense. But while I think Complex makes some good points, I think they also shun the underground and alternative and indie hip-hop sectors, which is where the real quality action is these days, whether you're young, old, or in between. I think slighting years like 1990 and 1999, I think that's a mortal sin on Complex's part. While they made some really good points about the mid to late 2000s kind of being crappy times for hip-hop, I think this list just doesn't take into account those underground and alternative hip-hop factions. Hip-hop is all-encompassing. It appeals to so many different people for so many different reasons. There's different styles, there's different factions, there's different scenes, and I think Complex more or less focused on the mainstream, where they should have sort of been looking elsewhere, looking deeper. I felt like Complex did not really dive deep like they should have. Hip-hop in 2024 is very broad and diverse, and while I think it can be actually a little bit too broad at times, there are endless possibilities for discovery if you're a hip-hop head. I just wish Complex put less emphasis on who was charting and how many units were being moved. And while I think it is challenging and rather subjective to pick 10 years that are the worst years in hip-hop history, I think it's a tough thing to do, but I just don't think Complex went about it in the right way. We all have our own opinions and tastes, and at the end of the day, what I say is not gospel. It's far from it. I just feel like a lot of important things got missed here, and overall, I'm pretty disappointed. Ultimately, I really do enjoy analyzing and speaking about why I feel the way I feel. So while your list mostly sucks, Complex, I'm glad you did this because it gives me an opportunity to talk about something that I love.